very nice to be here today. Very nice to be back in Vienna, because I've lived here for 4 years. And now being in Oslo, I miss it a little bit, I must say. And one of the reasons why I miss it a little bit is precisely, there was a question during the first session about Western Europeans and Middle Europeans. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, closer. Yeah. And I'm a Western European. I'll explain why. Churchill once said that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. So I think it's a good idea to organize this conference today. 100 years after the fall of the Habsburg Empire, we do well to study it. But in my view, that's where the difficulties start. The history of Habsburg and the unraveling of Habsburg is extremely complex. There are so many aspects to it that it's also difficult to choose. Like, what are we looking at? What do we want to look at? Which aspects do we choose to make our point? And how have these aspects been transferred to us? Frankly, the more I try to understand, for my new book, which indeed has to do something with Habsburg and the EU, the more I try to understand the parallels and the differences between the two, the more careful I am with judgment. The more difficulty I have to make up my mind, in other words. As I said, I come from a totally different world. I think I once had a discussion with Emil Brix about this, and he said, you Western Europeans, you can learn from Mitteleuropa, because we tend to look at the past. We are very much determined by our past. And you Western Europeans, you always tend to look forward. You ignore the past. Worse even, growing up in the Netherlands, going to school in the Netherlands, our history classes were not about Europe at all, let alone Habsburg. I hardly knew Habsburg existed. We all were educated, if at all, in history, it was about transatlantic relations. So I came here in 2014, straight after 10 years in Brussels, and I fell off my chair, actually. We lived in Hietzing, next to the Schönbrunn Palace, in a lovely neighborhood, which we soon discovered was still, to a large extent, or to a certain extent, in any case, an impressive extent to me, populated by people, families, you know, descendants of people who used to work for the Kaiser. There were the Thuns, there was a grandchild, I think an old grandson of Franz Ferdinand we had as our neighbor. We rented an apartment, I will not mention names of course, but we rented an apartment from a family who were, we soon discovered in the neighborhood, referred to as those who still think they were the closest to the emperor. And opposite us, almost, was a big house which seemed to house many generations of one and the same Esterhazy family, which established, moved there or built that house because they worked at the Schönbrunn Palace for the emperor. Very close to us was a little a sort of a patch of grass with some trees and flowers, and it was called the Katharina-Schratt-Platz. And we looked out on that Katharina-Schratt-Platz, more or less. And one day we were having a barbecue with some neighbors, and I said, who was Katharina Schratt? Total silence in the kitchen. They were all looking at me. And one said, you don't know who Katharina Schratt was? Amazing. I assume you all know, of course, who Katharina Schratt was. She was smuggled into the palace via the side door. all this, I mean, it's like a little anecdote. But this is very much the world of Vienna still today. For me, it was totally new. So I understood, if you want to understand Austria, if you want to understand Austrians, Vienna, study Habsburg. So that's what I started doing. I was reading an awful lot of books, and still am, because there's no end to that either. And soon I started to discover there were a lot of similarities. Jan already ticked lots of those boxes, or tried to. The multinational aspect, the multilingual aspect, the fact that the empire keeps large nations more or less in check, so they don't run all over the small ones, provides security for small states and nations and minorities. And the other thing that struck me straight away is that both had an incredible distaste of war. You know, the Habsburgs, they waged wars, but they preferred actually to marry off their sons and daughters. And the EU is the same. They're bending over backwards in order to stifle or prevent conflicts. Then in 2016, while I was discovering all this, there were many people actually all of a sudden asking me to do stories about Habsburg and the EU. This was the year of Trump. It was the year of Brexit. And it was the year that Mr. Hofer almost became the president of Austria. And people were predicting that Wilders would win in the Netherlands the year after and Le Pen in France. Remember that atmosphere? I was on Twitter. Sometimes I couldn't show myself for days because I was just blasted there. There was an immense pessimism in Europe. And the question on many people's minds was, will the EU end up like Habsburg? Everybody, of course, bought new editions of Die Welt von gestern, of Stefan Zweig. I started studying it more intently and discovered even more similarities. One which strikes me as more or less a connoisseur of EU politics is how both Habsburg and the EU are permanently negotiating with their different parts to keep everybody sort of happy. And then when one negotiation is finished, because a member state wants to have more special treatment on one issue, then it's finished, and then the next member state will have to be accommodated. This is exactly how Vienna dealt with its different nations all the time, and it was never finished, by definition. Another thing that struck me and strikes me still is the cynicism of the intelligentsia. We still all read Krauss, we still all read Zweig and Joseph Roth and so on. I'm constantly reminded of them when I follow contemporary politics and the discussion about, for instance, democracy in Europe right now. But I see a lot of differences too. I've been doing lots of interviews exactly about Habsburg and the EU, and everybody I talk to picks out different things from Habsburg, referring to now. Some people say, see, the Habsburg went under because of nationalism. This is exactly what happens to the EU. Look at Catalonia, look at Brexit in a way. And then somebody else says, Habsburg and the EU? No, there's no comparison. It's actually Great Britain and Habsburg that have to be compared. Both are failed empires. So the EU has nothing to do with it. It's not an empire, according to that school. So there are lots of different theories, and they all more or less hold or don't hold, but they exclude one another. Everybody picks and chooses. What is also important in my view is that if we want to draw a comparison between Habsburg and the EU, we have to exactly know how Habsburg ended, you know, if this is what we're after, answering that question. Is it overstretch, imperial overstretch? Is it nationalism that we have to be wary of, or is there something else? And I think the book of Peter Judson was mentioned already before, but his take of the end of Habsburg is a completely different one. He is saying that actually it is the war that ended the Habsburg Empire. Maybe it would have otherwise ended much later, or not at all. It would have morphed into something else. It was the war, actually, that robbed people of their social security, of their salaries. Don't forget, Habsburg had lots and lots and lots of ordinary citizens on the payroll, and the EU does not. Because of the war, the emperor couldn't pay for the salaries anymore, and lots of reforms that were ongoing were completely stopped because all the energy and focus was on the war. And this led to actually people, according to Johnson, to actually people finally lending their ear to the nationalists, who had for many years in vain tried to advocate the breakup of the empire. To conclude, because I think I'm nearing my...
Yes, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, wow. To conclude, I think the jury is still very much out. I think the comparisons actually are probably more telling about us, ourselves. Because, I'm coming around now really, because it all comes back to the question, which aspects of the empire, of history, are we choosing to look at, you know? There is so much there that I would very much like to warn for people, you know, to warn people not to jump to conclusions too much. This is a tendency of our modern days, and I think we have to be very, very careful with that. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Between August and November 1947, the Hungarian-born social scientist and short-term Hungarian Minister for Nationality Affairs in 1919, Oskar Jászai, now professor at Oberlin College in the United States, visited Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Comparing the situation in the former historical center of the Habsburg monarchy with the present, Jászai recognized that the rivalries and dissatisfactions of the various national units had been used as a lever by its enemies for creating a new equilibrium in Central Europe by dismembering the dual monarchy and by reducing the sphere of influence of a great ally in the war, the German Empire. Among many others, Jászai too had analyzed the many errors and mistakes of the Habsburg monarchy. In 1929, Jászai published in the United States the book, The Dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, still worth to read, criticizing, for example, the morbus latifundii, as well as the Irredenta movements and many others points and structures of the monarchy. Now, Jászai in 1948 said, quotation, "But looking back on it now from a perspective of the last 30 years, even the staunchest opponents of the Habsburgs cannot deny that in their realm the rule of law was tolerably secure. Individual liberties were more and more recognized. Political rights continuously extended. The principle of national autonomy growingly respected. also on different levels. The free flow of persons and goods extended its benefits to the remotest part of the monarchy. The German language became a kind of lingua franca, which made communication easy between the commercial and intellectual classes of Germans, Magyars, Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, and Serbs. This contact was incomplete, but a real one. End of quotation. Jassy stressed that the Paris peace treaties had not carried out the resonant principle of national self-determination, but had created nation-states with huge national minorities. Now, a new and even more vociferous identities came into existence. There was a universal feeling of tension and dissatisfaction, which troubled many hundreds of thousands even in their private life. Disrupted families, lost homes, officials ousted from office, a winter without fuel in Hungary and Austria, a winter without bread, in Subcarpathian and Rosinia as well as in Vienna, frontier regions without communication, foreign administration instead of the traditional administration. Democracy could not thrive in the new states, which became more and more militarized and fearful for foreign aggression. The interest of the ruling nation became sacrosanct as the unique aim of state policy. The feeling of national insecurity was growing everywhere, and new military alliances, open and secret, developed for either the maintenance of or the destruction of the new international equilibrium. Statesmen and journalists of a more acute mind and above the petty national controversies became conscious of the fact that this situation would lead to a Second World War. Of course, this was in retrospect. According to Jassy, Hitler disregarded the existence of all the nations as second-rank issues. He used the dissatisfied nations to undermine states, inimical to his plan of dominating Europe by his super race. However, when the Nazi Germany collapse came, the two Western Commonwealths were unable to counterbalance the ties and fanatic dictatorship of Russia in the expansion towards Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, Danubia, and the Balkans. With the exception of Austria, Jassy observed the same general pattern in all these countries. Redistribution of land in those states where agrarian feudalism was still rampant, ambitious government planning and nationalization of industries, following as far as possible the Russian model, meaning the Soviet model, of course. State-controlled foreign trade and the development of backward areas. All key positions in the hands of the communists, penetration by them of the army and the police forces, a propaganda organization entirely subservient to the Russians, the Popular Front theory emasculated, and the rule of one party with a fake participation of other parties. Also, the once glamorous Vienna made a macabre impression to Jassy, as he said, with people often looking hungry and apathetic. It seemed to him that Austria is the real bulwark of Western economic and cultural life. Also, the Russians had confiscated the so-called German properties in Austria, some 300 plants and thousands of acres of estates. Communism had made no headway because the Social Democrats and the People's Party had established a united front against Sovietism. The unpopularity of the Russians increased when Colonel General Vladimir Kurasov flatly refused to consider the lowering of the occupation costs by the Soviets, and when he bluntly told the Austrians that they were guilty for war crimes and the war just as the Germans. Coming to Prague, Jassy found a completely normal life in the overcrowded city, which has remained almost untouched by the calamities of the war. However, Jassy heard strongly opposing opinions. Many intellectuals didn't believe that the present dictatorial tendencies of the communists would last. Also, they received 38% of the votes in the unfettered election of 1946, in May 1946. The Czechs intellectuals thought, quotation, that in 2 or 3 years the republic will return to normalcy as a parliamentarian democracy and a bridge between West and the East, end of quotation. However, they, the Czech intellectuals, distrust the Marshall Plan and are deeply convinced of the peaceful intention of Marshal Stalin, end of quotation. In contrast, Czech businessmen recognized the infiltration of a significant part of the army and of the police force by communist propaganda, and the intimidation of industrial plants and peasants in the provinces by local communist groups. Astonishingly, also Jassy finished his report in August 1948, and he published this half a year later. This was half a year after the coup d'etat in Prague in February 1948. He came to the wrong conclusion, even Jassy to a wrong conclusion, that Czechoslovakia still has a good chance of maintaining its Western democracy, the democratic form of life. In an epilogue, Jassy admitted that he was astonished by the rapidity of the coup d'etat and that it showed how blind my liberal Czech friends were in judging their own possibilities. Summarizing his impression, Jassy stated, "It is in a certain way the renewal of the all-embracing Habsburg Empire with a diametrically opposite ideology and methods. Instead of the divine monarchy of the Habsburgs, a world state of proletarian nature is emphasized. Instead of Catholicism, the system of dialectic materialism is the Russian state religion. Instead of aristocratic Austrian officers and officials, a proletarian army and bureaucracy. Instead of conservative tradition of the Habsburgs, a radical dynamism driving towards world revolution. But neither in the old Habsburg monarchy nor in the new Soviet orbit is there a place for states and nations who want to follow their own course. Every state and every nation is bound to the supreme will of the almighty superstate." End of quotation. A very thoughtful article of the former nationality minister. I would like to end my observations with a also very thoughtful article in the London Economist from September the 1st this year in the rubric Schalman, Life in the Centrifuge. And there you can read, "European leaders can learn from the weaknesses of Austria-Hungary. Europe's citizens today may have no affection for the bureaucracy, but like the subjects of the old empire, they will tolerate it for as long as it generates wealth and preserves their freedoms. Yet complex institutions, second-rate European commissioners, wasteful policy like the common agricultural one, and incompetent national governments across much of the continent all undermine that goal. To survive, the liberal European order, of which the EU is a pillar, must become leaner and more capable. But the fate of Austria-Hungary also showed that multinational units cannot survive times of hardship without a sense of common purpose. Thanks to the rise of English, budget airlines, the internet and university exchanges, today's young Europeans live much more European lives than previous generations. But politics is not keeping up. Nurturing a clear European identity is not just a romantic goal. It is the only way to make the project sustainable in the long term. hard though history shows this to be. So Europe's leaders must face the balancing act that defeated their Viennese predecessors. They must show the pragmatism needed to keep the Union afloat in the short time, while cultivating the vision needed to build common feeling in the long term. Many thanks for attention.
I agree with a lot of what Jan Zielonka said right at the beginning. In fact, he and I, although we didn't know each other, have been thinking similar thoughts over quite a long time. And I did... I'll pull the microphone right up. Okay, very well. Sorry, then I'll start again. I was saying I agree very much with the themes of Jan Zielonka. He and I have been thinking similar thoughts without speaking to each other for a long time. I, quite a long while ago, published an article comparing the European Union to not just to the Habsburg empire, but to a series of empires. If you ask what do empires leave behind, the answer is, well, a few coins and a few laws. At least that's what you get from Rome, and that's a bit of what you get from Europe. And maybe when the European Union, if ever the European Union disappears, maybe it will leave those behind too. What do empires provide? Well, they provide security, they provide freedom of movement, and they provide opportunities or the possibility of different cultures, different nations living different religions within the empire. They don't insist on uniformity in the way that empires do. I would also say that they have a kind of natural tendency to expand, because if you live on the edge of the empire, on the one side you have safety and civilization, and on the other side you have barbarians. And the people who live close to the barbarians would like not to have barbarians as neighbors. So they say, let's extend the empire into this region, and then we'll all feel safer, except that the next barbarians, the ex-barbarians, also want to reform. So there's a natural tendency of empires. But here I'm speaking of kind of voluntary empires. I'm not speaking of the colonial empires like the British Empire, though they leave sometimes some laws and sometimes some coins and sometimes an administrative system as well behind, because that's another characteristic of empires, that there must be an administration of the empire. If we look specifically at, because you're talking about legacies of 1918, one of the people who emerged from the British or Allied administrative structure in 1918 was John Monnet. And the conclusion that he reached from his experience in the war, where he had been running something called the Allied Shipping Executive, was that what mattered in international cooperation was not having a sort of legislature, which is what everybody tended to create, for example, in the League of Nations and in the United Nations. What mattered was having an international administration. And that, you could say, is a sort of imperial idea. And that's why when the moment came after World War II, his first thoughts were about the European Commission as being the core instrument of the European Union. The Council was created as an afterthought. It's turned out to be at least as important as the Commission, but nevertheless, a shared executive is a vital part of a well-functioning empire, and that's the creation of Jean Monnet. That's dealt with 1918. I was going to go back to 1818. here is what Herr von Gentz wrote in 1818, another important figure in the history of Austrian diplomacy. And of course a Habsburg civil servant at the time, but that's not so important. What he writes in a letter at that time is 1818. The whole of the European powers have, since 1813, been united, not by an alliance, properly so called, but by a system of cohesion founded on generally recognized principles and on treaties, in which every state, great or small, has found its proper place. But it is not less certain that in the present circumstances of Europe, circumstances which she will not quickly get rid of, that this system is the one most suited to her needs, and that the destruction of that system would be a dreadful calamity, for, as not one of the states comprehended in it could remain isolated, all of them would enter into new political combinations and adopt new measures for their safety, consequently new alliances, dislocations, reconciliations, intrigues, incalculable complications by 1,000 different chances, all equally fatal, would bring us to another general war. That is to say, for the two terms are almost synonymous, to the definite overthrow of all social order in Europe. Well, for 1818, that's actually quite a good forecast of what led us to 1914. And for me, the important phrase in this letter of von Gentz is one phrase. Actually, this is, I think, more or less a single sentence I read out to you, and I apologize for not reading it in German, because I'm sure that it's a, but I only have the English translation of it. It's a very beautiful, long sentence. But the bit of it that for me stands out is the point at which he says, as not one of the states comprehended in it could remain isolated. And that seems to me is the nature of states in the modern world, that they cannot live alone. And then the only question is, in what way are they going to live with each other? And you can see this tendency working in the run-up to 1914. And the success of the European Union is to find a way of channeling that urge of states not to be isolated, not to be solitary, into a constructive activity, namely, essentially making regulations. There are, after all, there are really two forms. Two things are better. Mostly, small things are better than good things, as far as states are concerned. Small states are better run than big states. Look around Europe, you can see that anywhere. No doubt in this country as well. But I'm always, just as in passing, I'm very struck by how successful the Baltic states have been. Starting from nothing, they've actually produced, with ups and downs and so on, but they've done pretty well. These are the most democratic, most successful of all the new members. Small is beautiful in terms of state, but small is also weak, and you need two things. You need two things to be big. A big army is better than a small army, and a big market is better than a small market. And those are what the two key European institutions do for us, NATO and the EU. And I think I conclude by, because it's a sort of, if you're British, it's a preoccupation. I conclude with one word on Brexit, not my word, but this is taken from an article in the Daily Telegraph a paper I read on the basis that one should know one's enemy. And this is an article by their defense correspondent, which is entitled "The Great War Has Lessons for Global Britain." And in the middle of a rather odd article, but in the middle of this article, he refers to the meeting of Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, and says, such unions between French and German leaders are, of course, watched with a great suspicion in Whitehall. Well, actually, having worked in Whitehall, I wouldn't say that was the truth, but they're watched, I would say, with great suspicion by the Daily Telegraph. This is of particular interest at the Foreign Office in the role of Mr. Macron might fashion himself. Now Mrs. Merkel has indicated that she is mortal. Domestic support for the energetic French leader may be in freefall, but this has not been dampened his enthusiasm for wholesale reform of the European project, changes to which he hopes will help the EU achieve its dream of becoming a superpower to rival the United States. And then he goes on to say, ensuring that Britain is not put to a disadvantage by such French-inspired delusions of grandeur is one of the reasons the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, is keen to provoke a national debate on what he calls global Britain, looking at the role the UK can play once we have freed ourselves from the EU's tiresome shackles, establishing strong alliances based on shared objectives, the same formula that helped us achieve victory in 1918, is, to my mind, vital if Britain is to be able to defend and project its interests, both at home and abroad. And the obvious place to start is with the US. And so, in practice, Mr. Coughlin, his name seems to be, defense correspondent of the Telegraph, is proposing that Britain should now start creating alliances against Europe. Yeah. I think the only comment I'd like to make on that is, how stupid can you get? But it does illustrate the point that I was making, that states cannot remain isolated. And therefore the question is, how do you arrange them to be unisolated?
I have only a small remark to Mrs. Gruyter. When you mentioned that the Habsburg did more for marriages than for wars. Counting together the period from Emperor Maximilian to Emperor Charles, the Habsburg Empire was more in war than in peace. Looking to the years, we shouldn't forget this. So it was not. It was sometimes provoked by themselves, sometimes aggressions from abroad. The Ottomans, the French, the Prussians, others, and at the end, the Great War, and as Peter Judson said, well, I totally agree with his conclusion that the Great War broke the Habsburg Empire. Not before. It was not a failed empire before the Great War. Yeah? I'm very sure for this. And even Wilhelm Steed, when he returned in 1913 back to London, said this very clear. After the war, he said other sentences then, yeah? But this was after the war. So making a great war against more than half of the world was impossible for such a rather small empire. It's very clear. Yeah? And as one American colleague said last week at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, especially the hunger broke the empire away, especially Hungary. The empire was not able to feed the population, not to speak from the soldiers. All the born Viennese are knowing this, of course, from the grandparents and so. Thank you.
And the danger, if I may take that microphone again, and I think one of the main dangers nowadays is that whole generations have grown up with the idea that, you know, we're beyond war. War is not possible in Europe. I grew up like that as well. You know, we've overcome that, basically. And maybe one of the lessons of studying Habsburg as well, because the Habsburgers didn't want to go to war either. I mean, they couldn't even, because everybody was arming themselves. The Russians were arming themselves before 1914. The Germans were arming themselves, and the empire could hardly arm itself because they had all these budget discussions, and in the end, the army that went into Serbia was a complete ragtag army. You know, they were badly clothed, they were shooting at each other, at themselves rather, all that. So sometimes it's good to read up on all that, and maybe we have not sleepwalked into the war 100 years ago. I don't think we did. But it could happen again. And nobody knows what happens to Europe if you have all these big and small states without some kind of a frame to keep them all more or less in check. And I think this is the big parallel.
Well, only one sentence. I asked Christopher Clark why this title Sleepwalkers. He said the title was made by the publishing house. The book was not on sleepwalkers, but making war. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
I'm trying to remember what I was going to say.
Sleepwalkers.
No, I was going to say that it's not fashionable to talk about the European Union as a, to use the German terminology, peace project. And everybody says, oh, well, that's all in the past. Well, the answer is that's all in the past because it's been successful. And one of the things we need to do is to find ways of reminding ourselves of this. I mean, I remind myself of it intellectually by saying there are essentially two ways in which you can keep yourself secure. One is by having a very large army, and that does provide lots of security. Unfortunately, it scares everybody else, and that provides insecurity and therefore a kind of chain reaction. The other way of being secure is to have good political relations with all of your neighbors. And that's what the European Union has done, with lots of ups and downs and so on, but essentially that's the most important product of the European Union, and one which nobody notices. That is there are two things that people in Britain at the moment hadn't noticed. One, though they've been a little bit reminded of it, is they hadn't noticed that it wasn't just peace between France and Germany that came out of the European Union, but peace between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But nobody in Britain really ever takes much notice of Ireland. In fact, most people in Britain hadn't realized that we had a land border with the European Union. But they've become more conscious of it recently. But the other thing that they hadn't noticed is that relations with the European neighbors are exceptionally good. And they kind of assumed that this was normal. And this is why, from the Brexiters, you have an amazing, soft-headed, sentimental idea of what international negotiations look like. because they've only ever seen negotiations with friends and partners in the European Union. They've never actually been in a trade negotiation with a third country. Trade negotiations are about the most nasty, vicious negotiations that you could imagine. These people, unfortunately, think that the world is a nice place. And this is an illusion which has been fostered by membership of the European Union. But don't worry, they'll find out in due course.
No, but as you know, this concerns these generations of this. Your comment concerns only the last generations of diplomats and politicians. But as you know, when Britain negotiated entrance to the EU, it was anything but painless.
Sure.
It was very, very hardball bargaining, and as you know, first application was refused. Mm-hmm. And even more interesting story is how Britain actually ended up outside of SNAC financial integration system because the parliament just didn't have majority at the time, although the government was absolutely convinced they should stay, if only to conquer the position of the dollar, which is very interesting if you look at the archives today. But what I wanted to say is this. I absolutely agree that the EU made important contributions to peace and security in Europe, but I think we shouldn't overdo this. There were many other factors responsible for this, starting with the pacifying, Russians and even Soviet and American during Cold War, in a peculiar way, of course, when the Soviet Union as you rightly pointed out, was behaving, but also modernization, also the different way in which states and societies looked at what represents security, territorial conquest stopped to be the issue, and so on and so on. And it would be equally not credible to say that if integration stalls today, there will be, by definition, a new war. I don't think this works, and we have to be very careful not to overdo our argument, because it doesn't do any favor to the project of European integration. Although I agree with you, we cannot exclude that. I fully agree with what you said, that war has not been just condemned to the historical books. But to tell you something funny about this, because we are about why history matters. My wife is a historian, and at a certain moment she worked on a very prestigious university in Sydney, and there came a faculty dean and said to this really well-known department professors, you see, I look at your program and I've seen there is too much history, and especially too much about war. You know, can't you be a little bit more positive? It puts students off. And the funny story of this is that this official hasn't even made his homework, because had he looked onto enrollment of courses, these courses on war had the highest number of students. So, but this is where we are coming to. This is the irony of the current situation, is that while most of the political struggle is about the memory, the grants for research and teaching go the opposite direction. But the only consolations for you is that this is not only in departments of history, it's also in other departments. In economics today, you may think that you need an equivalent of new Adam Smith or even Karl Marx to understand how to reform capitalist system, which clearly is not doing very well. And yet, Adam Smith wouldn't get a job at any prestigious department of economics because they only hire mathematicians, which tells you something about the real world we live in.
Gerhard Reiviger, I'm a retired Foreign Service Officer of Austria. The similarities between the EU, some of the similarities between the EU and the Habsburg monarchy were mentioned, the type of governance and of course the multicultural aspects. And so this gives rise to sort of the fear that since the monarchy was destroyed, that the European Union might also not last. So now we talked about the reasons why the monarchy did not survive. And I think it was hinted at, but not clearly spelled out. There was this social issue, and nationalism wasn't just a goal in itself. The monarchy had snubbed democracy, the democratic development, and did not come to grips with what was then called the social question. And looking back at 1848, which is very important, is when the Habsburgs put down what they called the rebellion in Hungary, which was a democratic and a social movement, and this was sort of the origin of the problem. So now looking at the European Union, of course we are far from being in that danger, but there is talk about a social pillar, there is talk about a social union, which I think is very important, and we can see what the critics of the European Union and maybe some of them who want to destroy the European Union do. They talk about the European Union as a dictatorship. So there is democracy, and obviously in times when capitalism, as has been mentioned, is showing its dangers and disadvantages, people flock to the nation state to be protected. Thank you.
The name is Gernand. I come from the international credit business. Two comments for Mr. Cooper. He mentioned that the Baltic states have been sort of model EU citizens, and I agree entirely with that. I think one helpful factor was that they had at least one, probably two, very important and influential mentors in Sweden and Finland. I think Austria would have been in a position to play the same or a similar role for Hungary, Slovakia, and maybe Czechoslovakia, Germany for Poland and Czechoslovakia. But all that concerned Austria was to keep the migrant workers out for as long as possible without considering what would happen at the end of that transition period. But back to the Baltic states, at the same time as being model EU citizens, for example, Lithuanian crime syndicates are very active in Europe. For instance, the bicycle theft industry is dominated by Lithuanian gangs, and European police and customs have no ways of preventing the bikes from being brought back to their country. The other thing is about, as you called it, your soft-headed fellow countrymen. After all, that's 52% of your fellow countrymen. The UK, while in the EU, was always a very hard negotiator and was often enough able to avert a lot of nonsense. But when they had fought the battles and lost them, they were the most loyal EU member. They were the first to introduce whatever nonsense, or even, of course, good things the EU might have decided. And I think that may have been a factor which grated your fellow countrymen in reaching this decision in the end. And then I'd like to underline what Mr. Zielonka said, and in reply to Mr. Cooper. I've always been suspicious of this mantra-like argument that we have peace in Europe thanks to the EU. I would say instead that it's the the horrors of both the First and the Second World War that are sitting so deeply in the people and its politicians, still that war is not really an option. But I think the EU or Europe is closer to conflict today as it ever was, not to a shooting war, but certainly there are tendencies which are very dangerous.
Yes. Ruth Wodak, I'm a professor of discourse studies, retired, Lancaster University and University of Vienna. I have two questions or statements. The one is about the peace. Yeah? I have not experienced post-war Europe so peaceful. Just think of Yugoslavia, think of the invasion in the Czechoslovakia, 68. For me, those are images which are extraordinarily vivid in my memory. Of course, it might be the case, being Austrian, that that was very close. But both Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. But it was in Europe. And especially the Bosnian War was exceptionally horrific for all of us, I guess. So it's I think one cannot generalize about the European peace in that way. I'd like to know what you think about that. The second issue, and in that way, I would like to refer to what you said, is I'm missing the reference to 1938 and also to World War II. So I don't think we can jump from 1918 to 2018 because the EU is a response, of course, to World War II. And in that way, to the experiences of two world wars and what do you do afterwards and how do you try and make it impossible that that ever happens again. So I would like to have 1938 involved in this discussion.
So who starts? Yes, you're welcome to start if you'd like to.
1914 was not a clash of nationalism in the first line, but a clash of empires. Shouldn't forget. Of course, there were many problems, also the Habsburg monarchy, national problems, social problems, economic problems, but not so irredenta movements, but not really dangerous for the empire. But under the pressure of the Great War, all these problems increased then. More and more from year to year. We can follow the years, and this was then the main reason for breaking up of the Habsburg Empire. What Wodak mentioned, I fully agree, looking also to 1938. It was the Anschluss of Austria was the starting point of the empire making of Hitler. And most of the other empires and nation states, also in the neighborhood, did not recognize this. They still thought it was the fulfilling of the Anschluss movement of 1918, 1919, what was forbidden by the peace treaties, and why we should be against, the British said it, against this union of the Germans. Yeah? But Hitler thought in this, even in March 38, more than the British thought. Yeah? It was really the starting point, taking the gold and the money reserves for the National Bank immediately within some days, and now going east, first to Czechoslovakia and then Southeastern Europe, etc. So this is important, but once more back to 1914. perhaps we should learn from this and think about what would happen in the case of the clash of empires today, in the case of a clash between the American and the Chinese empires. And we should think also in Europe, it was not then only for the East Asian peoples and nations very dangerous. It could come to a backlash also to Europe, to Africa, even South America, I don't know. Such a clash of empires looking to the money they are investing in new weapons, etc., is not out of thinking. And the Europeans are doing, even in Brussels, this is not our case, this is not our beer, so to say, as we said in Vienna. A clash of empires. We should think more about this, learning from 1940.
I think Robert had said next, but then...
I'm going to give some answers. I can't quite remember what the questions were, but these are answers to points that were made from the floor.
Yes,
Some. All right. Well.
Please make your points then.
Well, you can tell me which.
Social Europe.
I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
Somebody said something about the EU being a mess. Well, that's true, and being accused of being undemocratic. That's less true. What I do think myself is I do think that the European Parliament is a failure as an institution. It's got lots of good people in it, and they do lots of good work, and something of the sort is undoubtedly necessary, but nobody knows who they are or what they do. And if you're looking at a parliament, that's not exactly providing democratic legitimacy. And personally, I think that something more like the original system in which the European Parliament reflected the result of national elections would be better, because national elections are the ones that people take seriously. The European Parliament has been a very good incubator for extreme parties, because they can mobilize a vote for an institution that nobody understands. On the question of the success of the Baltic states, I think there are lots of reasons, and they're probably different for the three states. I think that being small is probably easier. I think that maybe it's easier to start from nothing. They had no state for the previous
since 1940.
Since 1914, for a long time. So they didn't have much in the way of memories or baggage, so they could start with tabula rasa in a way that places like the former bits of Yugoslavia and the Czech Republic don't in quite the same way. And the mentors, I'm sure, helped. And they're not, of course, perfect, not just the Lithuanian bicycle thieves, but the Estonian money launderers and so on. On the other hand, what is striking about them is how well the democracy works. And that's important, because I think of there being two big weaknesses in the European Union. One is the European institutions themselves and their relative lack of legitimacy, and the other is at the level of the nation states, because democracy needs to continually adjust itself, and you can already see American democracy going down the tube. It doesn't look great in Hungary at the moment, and for myself, I don't think it's great in Britain. The referendum in Britain was a kind of failure of democracy. There was a little problem in the Conservative Party, which they thought they would solve by having a referendum, and by bad luck, this turned out to be at the wrong moment, and by a peculiarly incompetent government, and by a disgraceful campaign against, and won by a narrow majority. So for myself, I don't see why one should accept this as being a final, legitimate answer to a question. But I should also say that way back from the beginning, negotiating with the EU is hell, actually. It's hell when you join, and it's hell when you leave. And we, to put it crudely, in Britain, when we joined, we got screwed. The system was basically fixed against Britain to ensure that Britain was going to make maximum contribution to pay for French agricultural subsidies, for example, and so on. Common fisheries policy was happily abandoned as it was drafted to take advantage of the endowment of water provided by Britain and by Norway, which for that reason didn't join. So the EU is not a nice organization to negotiate with, as I say, either joining or leaving. The stupid thing to do is to join and then leave, or to leave and then join again, which could well happen. You can never underestimate stupidity.
To be fair, Robert, I completely agree with you, but it is very difficult to negotiate with the European Union because in so many fields it is a union of rules, a union of laws that came into being on many technical fields like the internal market, where you have all the member states coming together, all with their own hang-ups and interests. And the final result is usually takes like 3 years of fighting and making compromises. And then the rules are the rules. Everybody is slightly unhappy and slightly happy because they all got something and they had to give up something. I mean, this is the nature of the beast. It was glued into rules. And then there is one country saying, we'd like to change the rules now. And they're all like this. Because once you start undoing it, I'm not defending the system, but I'm just explaining that it is not that easy. And I think the negotiations of the United Kingdom with the European Union are non-existent. They are negotiating with themselves, basically. And you see it with the Swiss, who are now in trouble. I mean, this is not at all what I wanted to say, but the Swiss are now hijacked. The Swiss EU relations are completely hijacked by Brexit. I was in Switzerland recently. The Swiss, because they were small and they're so close, always been very difficult, but they always got, we told them, you know, you're not a member, you cannot co-decide, but come into the room. Huh? You sit against the wall and you listen, and at least you know what's going on. If you really have a problem, you can tell us. This often happened. Then came the Brexit vote. And the British know very well that the Swiss actually, as non-EU members, are allowed to sit in. So the Swiss have been showed the door. They're out. Now they have to renegotiate their relationship with the European Union. They want a whole list of all kinds of exceptions because we are this and because we are that. And the EU cannot say anything but no, because if they say yes, the UK will get it too. And it's very difficult to see it. And it's all about little things, little rules. And then the Swiss say, but for the hell of it, we want to be able to say no to the EU, just to show our people. It's so similar.
I tell you how to negotiate with the EU, because I did the enlargement negotiations when Spain and Portugal joined. And every time the Spanish rejected a proposal that we gave them, on the grounds that this was an insult to the honor of Spain, we took it away and made it worse. And eventually they worked out what was happening and just accepted whatever they could. The Portuguese, on the other hand, accepted everything they were given, and then afterwards read it carefully and realized that this was absolutely awful for them, and came back and said, particularly to the Commission, they said, please help us. We know that we're pathetic. We know that we've made a terrible mistake, but we're now in awful trouble. Please help us. This was very successful.
Yes. But can I for one more thing, because what I really wanted to say, there were several questions, and they all have to do with unraveling closer to conflict than before. What else did I write down? Peace, thanks to the EU. Is it going to fall apart? I'd like to point out to you that, yes, there are lots of crises in the EU, and they're ongoing, many of them. And I'm not going to mention them because you know very well what crises they are. However, on the other hand, there's another, thanks to Brexit. I'm sorry, Robert.
No,
thanks
fine.
to Brexit, there is also a different force moving, completely in parallel, which goes in the other direction. I am from the Netherlands. The Netherlands, we didn't have history at school, and we didn't have Europe at school. Nothing. The only thing that sometimes our prime minister would say is, the EU, it's a market. It's good for Philips, it's good for Unilever, you know, it's a bit the Anglo-Saxon way. All of a sudden, since Brexit, we're losing a big ally, because it was the Dutch who got the British, in the end, against 2 French vetoes, into the European Union. The Dutch are completely orphaned. The Danes are completely orphaned. Basically, the whole northwest of Europe is completely orphaned without, you know, our big liberal friends. So they have to start, they're on the lookout now for new alliances, because if you want to push something in Brussels, or you want to block something in Brussels, you need enough votes to make it work in the Council. So if you can't get your votes from your support from the United Kingdom, you have to look at Portugal, at Austria. All of a sudden, Dutch diplomats are traveling to Madrid, to Bratislava, to many places, in order to get them on their side for several issues. But those nations ask something back. This makes it very difficult now for the Dutch to do what they love doing, which is, you know, jumping up and down against Brussels and that corrupt this and all these proposals that we don't like to hear about. All of a sudden, they're moderating their tone. The same is happening in Denmark. The same is happening in Sweden. Because you have these multiple alliances, you also have to show more sympathy for the views of the others and for the point of views of the others. Moreover, since the Eurozone is going to be the center of decision-making, a lot of countries are actually trying to find a little hook. The UK used to slam on the table and say, look, as a non-Eurozone country, we demand that the Eurozone does not do this and that, and everybody would listen because they're big. But now, if the Czech Republic does this, nobody will pay attention, or Sweden. So they're all trying, nobody wants to be a second-rate country or in the periphery. So they're all, not because they fell in love with the EU all of a sudden, but, you know, because the mechanics are like this. This is a very integrating force. And all of a sudden, to conclude, the Dutch Prime Minister doesn't refer to the EU anymore as a market. He's talking about, even in French, plus jamais ça, never again. He's calling the European Union a community of values. I mean, something really interesting is going on here. Thank you.
Yeah, would you like to add something?
Look, when I listen to my friends and colleagues at this table, I ask myself, if it is so good, why it is so bad? Why those voters who for so many years supported European projects are no longer voting for it? That's the questions for 1 billion bitcoins, as you know, because we will not answer it easily. But we have to address it. And here lessons from Habsburg Empire are useful. Why? Because why Habsburg Empire, or monarchy, if you prefer, existed so long? Because it has been able to reinvent itself, time and again adjust to changes. I'm not sure whether the EU is so skillful in this as the Habsburg monarchy. And I give you 2 examples. You know, we today have the deadline for the Italian government to respond to the Commission request to change its budget. There is arrangements within the EMU which gives European Commissions legitimate grants to basically twist the arms of the Italian government. There is a small problem. This government has been elected by promising social expenditures that the European Commission wants to destroy. Who is about to decide about this? The arrangement, which is now, is totally unworkable, because if this government would basically say, we're going to compromise and do what the Commission tells you, the electorate would think, well, democracy doesn't make sense. We elected you exactly for those reasons, to introduce this social injection, because listening to the European Commissions and creditor states which dominate the Eurogroup basically brought only misery and zero growth. And you are now going to say that the EU is more important than our sovereign right to change the policy. Of course, you here, as in a credit country or AAA country, are unhappy with the situations either. You already had 3 bailouts for Greece, and if you basically try to make this government behave like Tsipras, you will have to pay 10 times more, with no guarantee that you will ever get those money back. Well, there are some optimists. We talked yesterday over the dinner. You believe the Italians eventually will pay back in 200 years maybe, but good luck. I just show you totally dysfunctional arrangement. Let's go other things. Let's take Schengen. How Schengen fared during 2015 crisis. The only politicians at the time who implemented literally Schengen was Viktor Orban. It tells you something about the arrangement. And what has the EU done, and I know that this is not the EU, but member states more than the EU itself, although the EU was very happy to be back. What we have done about migration crisis since the last crisis in 1991, yeah? Because I've seen the scenes which I've seen in Kennedy Station in Budapest in 1991, in Brindisi, Bari. I've seen the same scenes. What have we done? We have cut on development aid to North Africa and Middle East. We have basically abandoned the idea of stimulating investments there. We have sided with dictators like Gaddafi or Ben Ali in a hope that they will keep migrants there. We have them bombed some of those countries and left them later to the local warlords. And in the meantime, we were selling arms to anybody who wanted them. And then we were surprised when the things exploded, that thousands of desperate people were flying, risking their life. This is also Europe, of which I'm ashamed. And I don't see any lesson we learn, because we are now being told that, okay, Gaddafi is not there, but Mr. Conte, with some others today in Palermo, negotiating with some warlords in Libya, similar deal. And on additions, we are going to trust Mr. Erdogan that he will keep in this, they call it detention camps, but you know what other name could be used, those poor people there. We haven't learned anything. And this is, and it's not that those people who vote for other parties than pro-Europeans are just xenophobes. They just don't buy these policies, which are not only immoral, that are not only illiberal, but they are utterly ineffective and condemned to be ineffective from day one. And this is something we have to face too, because I'm not sure whether EU was in the driving seat with causing all these problems. But it also happened on the EU watch, as they say, yeah? And nobody apparently takes responsibility for this. So there is a problem. And the problem is not what I think, because I'm very pro-European. I would beef European powers rather than reduce them. I don't think that 19th century solutions will work for 21st century solutions as anti-liberal forces try to argue. You know, it's like applying aspirin or Levativ to the broken leg, yeah? But come on. We also have to understand why those people who voted for the project for so many years, never questioned it, now have said, okay guys, we will try some other options. And this is something we haven't talked about yet. And I think the essence of this thing is that EU has not been able to adjust to changes. How many times we talk about bringing people more to the projects, and we've done little about this? We've got Spitzenkandidat as a democratic solutions for European problem. We gave European Parliament, as Robert rightly said, more and more powers with each treaty, and less people bother to vote, and those who voted anti-Europeans. And we never, ever changed the course. Where has been last reformed the EU after the failure of European Constitution? And, well, this is a legacy we have to live with and face it. And this is last sentence, my lesson, academic answer to this, not political, I never did politics, is that we simply have done something what Habsburg Empire hasn't done. Habsburg Empire was not an empire composed of states. There were very diversified units, and states, if they were in the making, were of different sorts. We've based European integration, we gave nation states basically monopoly on decision-making and resources. And we came to the situations, which was envisaged by people like Mitrani already in the 50s, that integration led only by states will come to the moment that those states will either commit collective suicides and transfer those powers to the new center in Brussels and become local governments, or they will have to jump out. We see that none of these options is possible, because we see now that even Britain says to the rest of Europe, you should you should create financial governance next to currency. But the states are not going to do this, exactly for the reason I said. But we also learn with Brexit that jumping out would only make lawyers rich and everybody else poor. Because to untangle 20,000 laws and regulations, I think you describe it very well what it will be. And the only thing I can say, reading Jaroslav Hasek, is that if you cannot go up, you cannot go down, go sideways. And maybe this is the lessons from Habsburg Empire, but I will not bother you with my sideways proposition.
Brief response.
I have a very... I want to respond to this, because I totally agree with you. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful whom we attribute the responsibility for this. If the Italian government, which was for years, by the way, the only one who had a budget, who didn't have a budget deficit that was too high, so if now the budget deficit is too high, they go to Brussels like this, you know, let's see who is the strongest, we are democratically elected and so on, and we're not bending for your rules. You can also phrase this differently. The budget rules were established with all the governments at the table, and the Italians in those days were very powerful and influential in the Eurozone, which is not the case anymore now. They negotiated, they signed it, they ratified it, and they made it, they promised to the other governments, which is Brussels basically, they promised we will make it work.
So did France and Germany, you know.
Hang on.
So did France and Germany.
Hang on, yes. I'm not saying that it's good, not at all. So what are they exactly violating? That's my point. Are they violating the rules that some kind of bureaucrat in Brussels established? No, they violate their own promise. Mm-hmm. If you phrase it like this, it sounds completely different already. I think we could give the Italians some leeway, but the problem is trust. Second, the migration story. The migration story, I think, is exactly as you described it, an utter disgrace. But who is responsible for this? I was in Brussels at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, when we established Schengen. And when the Commission rightly said, if you eliminate all the interior borders, we have to make sure that we guard our outer borders very well, the Orban story. So here is Frontex, here is a bunch of other regulations that, in order to make it work, the member states said, oh, there's the Commission again. They always want power and they want money and so on. We're not going to give it to them. The Austrians were first of those, and the Dutch too, by the way, and the British. So there is this border force. We made sure they got like 100 people with a very tiny budget somewhere in Warsaw. So when the Syrians started walking into Europe in 2015, there was no Frontex to be seen. And now people are blaming the EU for it. I think it is an utter disgrace that we don't manage to manage this. But we should not blame the EU. We should blame the member states.
Well,
I think we have to make the distinction very, very clear. Otherwise, people don't get it. And I think we have to be really careful whom we address this story to. That's what I wanted to say.
Maybe I can just add to that, and that is there's what Caroline has described is the EU creating an institution and giving it inadequate resources, which is one of its method of dealing with problems, or rather of not dealing with problems. The other feature that you see in the European Union is that it creates very powerful offices and then does its best to find very unpowerful people to fill them, because the member states are jealous. They don't want to have a super powerful, really well-functioning, dynamic European Union, because that is a threat to their own kind of freedom of action, and therefore
sovereignty.
So therefore, after Delors, who was a forceful, dynamic, top-class president of the Commission, on the whole, we've gone for Luxembourgeois. And likewise with the High Representative, another extremely powerful office, I bet that the successor to Federica Mogherini will not be the person best qualified for the job. It will be the person least likely to cause trouble.
Unfortunately. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, please. And then anyone on this side? Yes.
My name is Dardis McNamee. I'm the publisher of a magazine called Metropole here in Vienna. My question actually has to do with public image and media, and also because it seems to me that part of the problem that the EU has had for a long time is that it doesn't believe in marketing itself. It doesn't believe in telling anybody what it's really doing, and therefore the people who benefit from it, unless they were actually paid on the worksite, don't really know what happened. Now, the Northern Irish do understand, which is part of the reason they're making such a big stink at the moment. But the Hungarians, for instance, Orban has managed to shift this around and make it look as if he's responsible for the success or moderate success of the Hungarian economy, when it's actually this massive flood of EU money that has done huge infrastructure projects, among other things. You drive through the country and there are little signs on the bridges, like tiny little logos or something underneath a stone that'll tell you it's an EU bridge. And, you know, this is unfortunate. And the things that have benefited so many businesses, like the restriction on the roaming fees for mobile phone communications and other similar kinds of EU-based digital regulation, enormously valuable for any member country. And you know, the EU never talks about this. I think this is a disaster. One of the, you know, think about the post-war United States. I mean, how many, was counted by number of people that we had like 87 military interventions around the world, and everybody still thought we were good guys because we market ourselves so well, and we tell everybody how wonderful we are, and we tell our children that they live in the greatest country in the world, even when it isn't. And so it's a massive marketing success, sort of the post-war American image as the good guy. So, you know, why doesn't the EU sell itself as the good guys of Europe? This is a mystery to me. And just the other half of this I just wanted to ask about that's connected to that. Just a second. Oh yeah, and related to that whether these the EU, like other international institutions, is falling apart. I don't believe it's falling apart, and I do agree with Mr. Gruyter that the EU is responding to Brexit by getting its act together a bit more than it was. I also, like Timothy Snyder the other night, told me that he didn't believe Brexit's really going to happen. Now that Joe Johnson has stood up, it's just possible the debate may change. I mean, it's a very interesting week we are in at the moment. We'll see what happens. Watch this space. You know, and in response to the comment over here that it was 51% of the British public, it wasn't. It was 51% of 48% or something like that. So like a quarter of the public, and because most people didn't vote.
37%,
Yes.
actually.
What?
I think we need to.
Well, never mind. That just so in the same way that trouble is revitalizing the institution in the EU, Trump is revitalizing the media in the United States. Do you agree with this or not?
Thank you. And we'll take the second question right away. We've already had someone over here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think so just the last question, if I may add. So obviously we have the problem of the collective action at EU level. So I come from the Croatian embassy, but I'm on one Austausch program here by the Austrian government during the presidency. My question is, so it's obviously we are faced with the problem of collective action at the EU level. Down the line to the next 10, 15 years, with the rising geopolitical rivalities in terms of course, Russia, Turkey, and China, do you think that this cohesion within the European Union would actually be strengthened due to these external threats, or unfortunately, like in the cases of some Eastern countries, the blockade of Article 7 or something could be actually misused, and the foreign impacts within the EU itself could enlarge and increase?
All right, thank you. So our challenge here are very brief responses from the four panelists, so thank you.
Start in that direction.
Okay, well, I will say very briefly to the lady here, you're right, the EU is lousy at PR. I think my answer to that is because it's not really a political organization. The heart of the EU is not, it doesn't do elections and things like that. People are not trying to get elected on the basis of the EU. And I've seen, and they also seem to have employed a lot of people who were ex-communists to write their slogans. I've seen on the, hanging on the Berlaymont, building a better future with DG statistics, for example, which sounded to me like something from, and I also mentioned, because I'm afraid it's my daily life, the point you made about Brexit, I've never seen a British government in such chaos before. And the chaos just took another twist of the knife. The Joe Johnson thing is very important, and we're coming up to a critical moment. And I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen, but it gets worse all the time. I agree with you that it's not right to say 51% of the British people. First, because it was 51% of the 37% who voted, but second, because the electorate was not entirely British either. The electorate was of all people who had the right to vote in British general elections, which includes Commonwealth residents. Now, I don't see why Nigerians who live in Britain should vote in the referendum on EU membership when Poles who live in Britain don't. And I also don't see why British people who live in France, if they've been there for more than a certain length of time, don't get to vote either. So this was yet another travesty of democracy. Nobody listened this year.
I visited Britain 3 months before the plebiscite. I was very astonished hearing my colleagues in London and in Cambridge who didn't care much about the plebiscite and even not the students. And this was, of course, a great failure. And reading today an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, I got the impression there is an increasing chaos in London between the parties, in the Conservative Party, in the Labour Party. Nobody knows now outside, even not in Brussels, what can happen in Britain the next month. Well, this is disturbing. The European Union, of course, but looking to the younger generation, I have the impression they are living within in a common market, in a common society, going there and there with the railways, with the planes, with the cars, without any problems. With one currency in most states, and I'm awaiting that this younger generation will stabilize in the future the structure. Perhaps we do need more younger people in our governments. Over Europe, and some chancellors and prime ministers govern too long, even in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I came to Vienna from Berlin, and everybody was saying me how great messes there are now in the Berlin, but probably everything is relative comparing to Britain. But look, we've discussed for a long time this morning, trying to understand the implications of the fall of Habsburg monarchy a century ago. And I think only a century from now we will be able to judge who here was right and who was wrong, those at the panel and those not present in this room too. But I know one thing. If pro-European politicians and activists will not mobilize during next European elections the young generations to bother to vote, I think it's finished, because the plan of anti-European forces, or let's say anti-liberal forces, is not to leave the Union. They just want to take it over. And they want to do it. Of course, they will not have majority, but they know that in many countries they don't have majority, and yet they run, not just, they define the narrative but they get center-right parties to join them in bed because they, on the program, which is very similar to the one they believed in. And if this will happen, it will be totally different ball game. And look, it will probably not produce one line, because Mr. Salvini can kiss Mr. Urban when it comes to policies. They have very little in common, and you can multiply those examples. But it will be different parliament, it will be different commission, and member states will probably look differently at these organizations as a means of solving the problems they face.
Caroline, you have the last word.
Famous last word. I completely agree with you. I think it depends what happens now. In my country, we have a very strong far right, extreme right, we cannot say anymore, apparently. It's far right now. Group. But somehow they're saying all kinds of things that I don't want to hear, and I thought I would never hear again. But what worries me even more is that a lot of people who don't agree with that, they keep quiet. They're not saying anything. And this I find very disturbing. And I think for the next elections, it is of the utmost importance that those people are going to vote and that they're not staying at home. Yeah. And lastly, I read an interview a little while ago in a Portuguese newspaper with the president of the Eurogroup, who is the Portuguese finance minister, Mr. Centeno. And he was asked, will there be more exits? And then he said, no, I think everybody's rather traumatized by Brexit, so we will not see more exits. Nobody wants that. Everybody will try to prevent it. But the big challenge for the next coming years is not a country that wants to go out. It is that there are several countries who refuse to go out, who want to violate all the rules and still stay in. And we have to find a way to deal with those. Famous last words. Thank you.
Thank you.